This is a Los Angeles that is on the cutting edge of every economic trend in the world.
I love LA. This is my home. I was born and raised here.
I love Los Angeles because it's a city that welcomed my immigrant parents.
Migrating to the West Coast, seeking a better life. That's why I love LA.
This November, Angelenos will choose a new mayor for the first time since 2013. Welcome back to Inside the Issues. I'm Ariel Wesler, in for Alex Cohen. Candidates for the job must not only understand the complex problems facing the city in 2022, but also how those issues affect one of the most diverse voting populations in the country. The Pat Brown Institute at Cal State LA, in partnership with the California Community Foundation, commissioned 2 new surveys to better understand the experiences of both Latino and AAPI neighbors, the county's largest and fastest growing ethnic groups, respectively. Here to detail those survey results is the director of the Pat Brown Institute, Dr. Raphe Sonenshein. Raphe, always great to talk to you and good to have you back.
Thanks, Ariel. Good to see you.
So a lot to get to. I want to start with the results of these 2 surveys that you released separately. You had the Latino data that you released on March 3rd and the AAPI data just this morning. Want to dig deep into it, but first, will you tell us why these 2 groups, and did you approach them with similar methodologies?
Well, this is part of a bigger project to survey 4 major groups, these 2 groups plus African Americans and Jewish voters, in order to do a deep dive with large samples into 4 of the principal political and social communities of the county. But we put these 2 together, and it's quite fortunate because these are communities that have had a long history of moving through immigration, have significant foreign-born populations and a gigantic native-born population. So we're actually watching communities in motion as they develop, these 2 communities. And we don't think that the elected officials, the candidates, the public, even the media knows enough about these communities to really do a deep dive and really try to do some explaining.
All right, well, let's dive in here. Let's talk about the results first from the Hispanic study. And I use that term because your data says 62% of those surveyed preferred that term to describe their ethnicity. They make up about 1/3 of registered voters in Los Angeles. Yet the survey also indicates little interaction between them and elected officials. So what did respondents say, and what is the implication for these mayoral candidates as they try to win votes?
Well, first of all, the community did prefer Hispanic, but they were also very comfortable with Latino and Latina. Both of those were perfectly fine, but more picked Hispanic. What we found is that the pandemic hit the Latino community extremely hard, and that it already an economically struggling community was really hit severely, and that kind of dominated much of the survey. But we did find something very interesting, which is instead of elected officials, there was a high degree of trust in healthcare professionals and teachers. Healthcare professionals and teachers. And it makes you think a little bit about how the world really works at the community level, which is you're looking for people who are delivering services in a trustworthy way to you. And if you want to get messages out in this community, those are 2 places you should start.
Interesting. Almost like those are the 2 that they interact with the most. They give them direct care, as you mentioned, or direct services.
And are helpful, are seen as ultimately helpful. People don't have mixed feelings at all about the healthcare workers and the teachers. And those folks, as everybody knows, have really been struggling themselves as public servants during this time.
So these 2 communities appeared to have some perhaps surprising commonalities as well. Take a look here. In their political leanings, their views on crime, their approach to civic engagement, and both also said the pandemic is still the #1 issue for them. But here's the distinction. For Hispanics, the largest impact is economic and health uncertainty. And for the AAPI community, it's been personal safety and a hate crime issue. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more for us?
Yes. Well, both of them picked homelessness and the economy as top issues, and to a lesser degree, crime. As I said, the economy is what really has hit the Latino community through the pandemic. But in the AAPI community, the rise of concern about hate crimes, hate attacks, and discrimination is off the charts. And it dominates the poll. It screams from the poll. And don't forget, today is the 1-year anniversary of the horrifying murders of women in Atlanta, the infamous spa murders. So there's already a great consciousness. But there, we saw numbers that 80% of AAPIs in LA County said anti-Asian racism has been serious. 2/3 are worried, some severely worried about hate crimes. Nearly a quarter of AAPIs reported being a victim of a hate crime, not always a crime in the traditional sense. It could also be verbal assaults and verbal confrontations. This is really very serious, and half say they experience racial discrimination in all kinds of settings, out in the streets and in other places like that. So where we found economic stress and discrimination very greatly concerning Latinos and being short of savings in an emergency, we found this situation of anti-Asian prejudice and confrontations to be just jumping out of the survey.
Given the hate crime, that we saw a year ago and those that we've seen more recently with the AAPI community in the last year, did those results surprise you at all? Just out of curiosity?
No, because a number of the people we spoke to and who, when we did our presentation today, joined in, this is consistent with national data among the AAPI community. This is perceived as basically an emergency across the country. Now, it happens that the center demographically in terms of numbers for the AAPI community is in Southern California and in Northern California, but there are growing communities around the country. And don't forget, those shootings were in Atlanta. So this is a national concern of this community, and it is just skyrocketed to the top.
And sticking with that community, based on your data, the AAPI experience in the pandemic appears to have lit kind of a political fire, so to speak, in that community. They've become more active or enthusiastic about the 2022 midterms. Do you see that also translating here to our local elections?
Oh, I'm certain it's going to. I think that, it could have gone a different way. It could have been that this prejudice that people are feeling and the sense of threat would demobilize people. Actually, it's turned out to be quite the opposite. In fact, we found in the AAPI data that those who consider discrimination something they have experienced directly are more likely to participate, more engaged, more likely to vote. And this community as a whole, which is often ignored, we found that vast numbers of the AAPI community, and by the way, also in the Latino community, are not being outreached by political candidates, by parties, especially those who are foreign-born, who represent very large portions of each community, and they're ready to participate, but they're not being reached out to. And I think it's time. It's time for people to take a fresh look at both of these communities and question one's assumptions about who's a likely voter and who's likely to participate. They're very energized and ready to hear a good case.
Well, and on that note, representation in elected officials scored highly in both groups, which would be good news for someone, say, like Kevin De Leon. But for non-Latino, non-Asian candidates, what would you say can be done to reach those voters?
Well, I think, you could say that people in both communities say they would like more representation from people from their own community, but they're also very attentive to issues. And that's not enough. I think they're going to be waiting for people who are going to talk about healthcare, who are going to talk about hate and discrimination, and are going to connect to them and do something quite radical, which is ask them what's on their mind. Mm-hmm. Which people in politics don't do very much these days. They usually start out with what's in the political leader's mind and try to sell it. That's not the right way to go always with these communities. So they're looking for people who will listen, participate with them, draw on them, and sometimes you'll be the first person talking to them in the political arena. And that's going to open up the political arena a lot in Los Angeles, we hope, from these surveys.
And we just have about 30 seconds left, but recent national polls have pointed to Democrats losing ground with Latino voters. Yet your surveys, both ethnic groups, kind of indicate otherwise locally. I'm curious why you think we're seeing such a difference.
Well, I've had a lot of questions about those national polls, because one reason we did large sample surveys is these large polls usually have pretty small samples of each of these communities. What we found, however, is a little bit more nuanced. We found very little support for the Republican Party in either community and very little support for the word conservative. We found good support for Democrats, good support for the word liberal, but we found a ton of people who were undecided, especially in the AAPI community. 45% or more in each nationality group consider themselves unaligned. So while the Republicans aren't making the inroads they think they are, the Democrats have not locked up either one of these constituencies, and they are in play And I think that means it's on people to reach out to them more creatively than in the past.
All right, a lot to think about. Dr. Raphe Sonenshein, director of the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State LA. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.